I am very delighted today to introduce you to Dr. Alan Barnard. Dr. Barnard was a very close colleague, associate, and friend of the late Ellie Goldratt. My view of Dr. Barnard is that he's probably one of the leading experts in the theory of constraints. And it is such a privilege for all of us to actually have Alan speak to us directly here in the session today. Alan is also an industrial engineer and has extensive experience in improving organizations across the board. So, whether it's in their supply chains, whether it's in the service industry or in manufacturing, he has a wealth of knowledge and is an expert and a trusted advisor to many, many, many companies. So we are really privileged to have Alan here with us today. And you'll be able to hear firsthand about the theory of constraints. So I'm sure that this will be one of the highlights of this series. So over to you, Alan. And again, thank you very much for doing this for us today.
Thank you, Dino, for the kind introduction. A little bit of background. As Dino said, I'm an industrial engineer. Grew up in South Africa. I'm CEO of Goldratt Research Labs, but I also serve on advisory boards of a couple of large companies. My research lab is really focused on just one thing, which is helping organizations make better, faster decisions when it really matters. And the way that we go about doing that is we identify what are the common decision mistakes that people in organizations can make, which of those are avoidable and consequential. There are many mistakes we make that are simply unavoidable. We don't want to waste too much time on doing root cause analysis on that, but there are many that are avoidable, and not all the avoidable mistakes are consequential. So we want to make sure that we focus on those that are avoidable and consequential. In terms of how we work with clients, it's really just helping them answer two questions. The first question is, how much better can you do? And that's a difficult question to answer, especially if you consider, imagine you have just joined a new organization, and this organization is really good at what they do. And there's always that anxiety in the first couple of weeks and maybe even couple of months about, is it really possible to substantially improve this organization if that is part of your responsibility? So that's the first thing that we do. And I'll share with you some of the concepts and principles and tools that we use to answer that question. How much better can you do? And the second one is, what is the best way of doing it? What's the simplest, fastest, lowest cost way of doing substantially better? One of the projects, for example, that I was involved in a couple of years back was I got a call. I was lecturing at an MBA program in Washington. I got a call from somebody that I trained in theory of constraints many years ago. They were from Microsoft. And they said that they were busy redesigning their global supply chain, and they were considering best practices, whether I was able to go and speak to them about theory of constraints. Well, the next day I was on the plane. I arrived in Seattle. I was told, good news, bad news. I said, what's the good news? They said, we've got the CTO of Microsoft that's going to be in the room. You've got an hour to convince him. That's the bad news. I said, okay. And if I do convince him in an hour, he said, well, you've got the rest of the day to convince his direct reports. And I said, if I'm able to do that, he said, then the second day we'll plan the implementation. That was on the 30th of August. On the 1st of September, we started the project. On the 15th of December, that same year, we went live in their SAP system with a totally new design of their global supply chain. And within the same financial year, they were able to reduce their inventories across the board by over $250 million and got sales up by a few $100 million. So that's the order of magnitude of results that can be unlocked, even in a company that you might consider to be the best in the world in what they do. I mean, they're the most valuable company on the planet. So that gives you an idea how these simple concepts can translate into incredible results. I also did a project, was very privileged to work with an incredibly inspirational woman, Kristen Cox. She is head of the Utah Governor's Office of Management and Budgeting. It's essentially the COO of the state of Utah. And we had a similar project there with the very simple objective was, how do you improve the productivity of every single government agency, regardless of what they are doing, whether it's the prison authorities, the lab that is doing all the testing, or the marketing department that's promoting Utah. And we had to come up with a new way of measuring productivity and then set about achieving it. And within the second year that I had started the project, each of those parameters were being achieved, a 25% improvement overall. So that's just a brief background about the range you can apply to private sector, to public sector, small, big companies, almost every industry that you can imagine. I've probably done some kind of project. So that's just a brief introduction. What I want to start today with is this quote that has inspired and haunted me for most of my life. When I read it the first time, I thought, wow, I was struggling to think about what I'm going to do. I wanted to help the world and thought, okay, engineering, science, psychology, economics, all of those were areas that I was considering, and they're all forms of science. And this quote I just love, Jean-Baptiste Perrin, he was a famous French scientist that did one of the first proofs of Einstein's theories. He said that the goal of all sciences is to substitute visible complexity for invisible simplicity. If you think about E equal to mc squared, right, it's incredibly simple, but it explains a tremendous amount of visible complexity out there. And that's essentially what we are trying to do also with the science of management. Whether you're looking at theory of constraints or lean, we are all seeking that same thing, is that there's inherent simplicity within all these complex systems, but it's not visible. What is visible is a tremendous amount of complexity. And that's what I want to share with you today. Over the last 30 years or so, what has been my major insights in terms of where this invisible simplicity is. I want to start off with just a question that I'm often asked is, what is theory of constraints? And by the way, why is it called a theory? You know, we need something that's practical in my organization. And I remind them of this famous quote by Dr. Kurt Lewin, who was one of the pioneers in social psychology. He said, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. In science, we define a theory as simply a good explanation about why something is important and useful. So if you hear theory of relativity, you'd expect to hear what is relativity and why is it important and useful. Theory of evolution, the same thing. So in theory of constraints, you'd expect to find out what the heck is this thing called a constraint and why is it really useful and important, especially for managers, is you are responsible for making reliable commitments. And secondly, are responsible for making decisions that are enabling you to meet those commitments. And part of those commitments would be not just achieving a certain target today, it's your responsibility to continuously improve. There are really 5 decisions that theory of constraints provides you with a framework that's really important and useful to make these type of decisions much faster and much better. The first one is how do I set a goal in an organization that's both ambitious, but at the same time achievable? And a traditional way of goal setting would be, I'm simply adding a reasonable percentage to my previous year's performance. But how do I know that's even possible or that not much more is possible? Well, if I knew where the constraint is in the system, and I know the potential that we are wasting of that constraint, and I know which of those conditions that I could satisfy to close that gap, I can set very achievable, but also very ambitious targets. So for example, if the constraint is a specific machine and there's 24 hours available and only 12 of those hours are productive hours at the moment. The rest I'm losing because of starvation or blockage or overproduction or quality defects or planned or unplanned maintenance. And I can identify which of those conditions are avoidable conditions and consequential. They contribute a big part to that gap of potential throughput that I'm losing. I can use that as a mechanism of setting goals. So that's the first part, is how do I set ambitious but achievable goals? The second part is understanding that these systems are so complex. Where do I focus my limited attention and budget? And of course, knowing where to focus is, where is the constraint in the system? What do I not have enough of? The next question, which I'll show you an example of, is how do I measure the impact of local changes on the whole system? Well, it should be quite simple. If I have a single constraint, one weakest link, then it should be very simple. If I make a change to the organization, will it help or harm this constraint? Will it allow me to produce more or not? If the answer is yes, then it will be helpful. If the answer is no, it would not be helpful. That's a way of sort of fast tracking or almost creating a kind of a hack in terms of how do you quantify the system-wide impact of local changes. If I know what the impact will be on the constraint, it's kind of a proxy of what the impact will be on the whole system. The last two questions are really interesting. It's how do I know what are the rules to manage my system so that I achieve global optima and not local optima? And it turns out that the rules to better exploit and elevate the system constraint is also the same rules that will benefit the system as a whole. And that's a really important one. And I'll show you some counterintuitive example in the same way that some of the principles and rules that we've evolved with lean, there are also some very counterintuitive rules that have been involved in the theory of constraints and the various applications of theory of constraints, all the way from managing operations to managing supply chains to managing projects, marketing, sales, finance. Often these rules to achieve global optimization are very counterintuitive from a local perspective. And that's why an operations manager could be there for 30 years and never discover that overproduction is the major cause of the gap between what they expect to get out of the system and, for example, what's currently being achieved. They will blame, labor productivity and the fact that customers can't make up their mind and that suppliers are unreliable and that the investors don't want to give them enough capex. They'll find other reasons. They'll never realize that actually one of the rules they are using to keep their machines busy, which is, produce as much as you can, that's in fact the main reason for the gap in performance. And then the last important decision is, when do I change the rules? And what theory of constraints tells you is, if a constraint moves, you have to change the rules. So if you want stability, make sure that the constraint stays in the same place. So that's just a quick summary of my insight over the last 30 years or so of why theory of constraints as a theory is a very important and useful explanation about the importance of constraints in managing complex systems. So I'll continue and we'll open up for some questions at the back end. So please type those into the chat boxes, make notes as we go along. I'll leave at least about 30 minutes at the end for questions.
Yeah, and just on that,
yes.
I've asked everyone to just put their questions, and we can ask them at the end. I'll group them if necessary. There is one quick question you might want to answer now, and what happens if the constraints are more external as opposed to internal? How does one apply Rule 4? So you might want to just
so
that apply.
Think about an external, so an internal constraint is there's some resource that I don't have enough of, right? I don't have enough capacity, I don't have enough skill to meet the demand that's been placed on me. When we talk about an external constraint, it could be that I don't have enough market, I don't have enough cash to fund my operations, I don't have enough supply. But the same principles will go true. I'll share with you those principles when I go through the 5 focusing steps in the next slide. So just if you go and search what is theory of constraints, a different way of answering it is not to focus on the theory part, that it's a good explanation of why constraints are important but useful, is you can look at what are the parts of theory of constraints. It's a very vast body of knowledge. For example, 2 weeks ago, we had our International Theory of Constraints conference, and we had presentations there from the US Air Force to McDonald's applying theory of constraints within their operations to be able to switch over from making sandwiches to stock to making it to order, so it's always fresh. So it's a very wide body of knowledge. It's made up of a number of parts. And I'll use this masterclass to share with you just briefly what each of these parts are. The 5 focusing steps, that's a core process that we use whenever we are analyzing any new system or organization. You then have a range of logistical solutions. These are solutions that are made up of a set of rules, typically planning rules, execution rules, and improvement rules. One of those would be what Dino had mentioned, drum buffer rope, but you also get other logistical solutions like critical chain project management or the TOC replenishment solution, similar to demand-driven MRP. These are all logistical solutions that help to improve the performance of organizations. And often those rules that has been discovered as part of these mechanisms can be quite counterintuitive. Throughput accounting is a mechanism of being able to quantify the financial impact of local changes on a system. I'll share with you an example of that. Thinking processes is a set of tools that we've developed. And I'll share with you one that I'd recently developed called the Procon Cloud method, which is a way of being able to discover and overcome limiting assumptions or beliefs that's holding us back from achieving more of the goals that's important to the system. And then the strategy design part is sort of putting all of this stuff together that says, if I'm trying to design a strategy for my organization, whether it's private or public sector, small or big company, and I want to 10x the results, right? That sort of represents a step change in the results. How do I go about doing that? How could I use the 5 focusing steps to design an overall business strategy for me that will allow customers to buy more, pay more, or buy more often? So I'll give a quick example of that right towards the end. Each of these has been designed there to answer a specific set of questions. I'm going to go right into it. So 5 focusing steps is also always about, first of all, understanding what is a constraint and how is it important to manage. The logistical improvement solutions are there to improve and protect flow. Throughput accounting, as I mentioned, is there to evaluate the global impact of local changes. The thinking processes are there to help us discover and overcome limiting assumptions. I have one of the things that we do in our research lab is we develop decision support apps. One of those apps is called Harmony Decision Maker. It's a free app that you can download from any of the mobile app stores at the moment. And that's specifically designed to help you discover and overcome limiting assumptions, not just in managing the organization, but even in your personal life. And then, as I mentioned, the strategy design side is how do I get this exponential improvement by focusing on a few high leverage points. So let's start with number 1. Probably, if any of you have read up anything about theory of constraints, this is the thing that is most commonly published as a core element of theory of constraints. It's based on the principle that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So how do I apply it? Well, the first step is always, what is the goal of the system? How am I going to measure it? What are the resources that I need in order to achieve this goal? That's sort of defining the system for me. And the reason why that is important is if we have different understandings or different goals, then what is a constraint will not be the same. So that's the first important part, is there has to be agreement on what is it that we're trying to achieve. And then we can say, what is a constraint? What is the resource that I don't have enough of to achieve that constraint? And that leads you into step 1, is identify the system constraint. What is the system constraint? And you'll see that it's put in plural because most real life systems have multiple constraints. There are many resources that I might not have enough of in order to achieve the goal. And when I say many, I'm simply referring to more than one. There's always few. So there's sort of 2 extreme parameters. The one is every system must have at least a single constraint, else they would be producing infinite goal units. At the same time, they can't have too many. There's only a few system constraints in a system. The second step is, how do I better exploit and not waste the system constraint? Then subordinate everything to the above decision. Go and find any policy or measurement or behavior in the system that's causing you to waste that constraint, and change only that. So don't change everything in a company. Only find those policies, measurements, and behaviors that is in conflict with the decision about how to better exploit and not waste the constraint, and only change that. And that's essentially those rules that I mentioned about. So when we're identifying what are the rules to change, we want to find out what are the rules that's blocking us from better exploiting or elevating a constraint. Step 4 is elevate the constraint. Now get more. You've already exploited all that you've got. If the constraint was in cash, you're already exploiting all the cash that you can get from your investors. Now go and get cash somewhere else. If it's in the market, you already have the major market share. So in order to further elevate your performance, you have to go and get more, either by developing new products or going into new markets. Or if it's on the supply side, you're already getting all the specific raw material, the skills from your supplier, but you still need more. Now go and get an alternative supplier. Or if it's in the capacity, you're already exploiting the machine capacity to the fullest extent. You've prevented it from wasting capacity because of overproduction or starvation or blockage or quality problems or planned or unplanned maintenance. Now's the time to go and buy another machine or get another salesperson. But it's always first exploit what you've got before you elevate. And that's one of the common mistakes that people make, is when they don't have enough of a certain resource, they immediately ask for more. We need more machines, more people, we need more budget, we need a new IT system. They don't think about, first of all, this, how can I better exploit what they've got? And then the last part, as I mentioned, is this is a process of ongoing improvement. So you want to check what if in the previous step a constraint has been broken, go back to step one. But when I go back to step one, if a constraint has moved, I have to change the rules. So try to make sure you don't change the constraint. Keep the constraint in the same place. So design your system to be able to either sell whatever you can produce or produce whatever you can sell. So those are two different business strategies that I'll cover a little bit later. And just visually find out where this weakest link is. Identify the constraint means what is that gap that's available for better exploitation. Deciding how to exploit that constraint is identify what are those conditions where we are losing potential. Subordinate means changing the rules, breaking the conflicts that's blocked me from satisfying those conditions. Then go to the elevator constraint, go and get more, but be careful to leave enough protective capacity. And lastly, even with elevator constraint, there could be some policy that's blocking us from doing that. For example, a hiring freeze. You know, I can clearly see how by adding one more salesperson or one more operator in the shift can dramatically increase the throughput. But we've got a hiring freeze going on at the moment. So I'll have to resolve that conflict between making a change that will benefit the system versus making a change that will potentially harm my product, my efficiencies, etc. So that's just a visual description of the 5 focusing steps. Why are system constraints so important? First of all, what is a constraint? There's many definitions out there. The simplest by far, which is the one that I use, is that a constraint is simply a resource that does not have enough capacity to meet the demand that's placed on that resource to achieve a goal that you've committed to. So there's a goal for the system. You need resources to achieve that goal. Which resource don't you have enough of? Or which resources don't you have enough of? An interesting thing about constraints is that we can actually use it to define how complex a system is. So one traditional way of defining complexity is what are the number of parts or interdependencies in the system? The more parts and interdependencies, the more complex the system. A different way of describing complexity is to purely look at the number of constraints and the interdependencies between those constraints. That's a very simple but very profound way of looking at complexity. And let me give an example. Here's a simple system. It has a single constraint, and that constraint is properly buffered. So behind it, there's a buffer that makes sure it's never blocked. Hopefully in front of it, there should be a buffer to make sure it's never starved, so there's enough demand to keep it busy. This is a very simple system to manage. One single point that I can manage the whole system for by making sure that the constraint is never starved and blocked, I'll maximize the performance of the rest of the system. I don't have to pay attention to B, C, D, or E unless they start causing the constraint to be either starved or blocked. That's a simple system. A complex system is one that has multiple constraints. So we've committed to a goal that the system is not able to achieve. So we've committed to our customers to achieve 100 or to our shareholders to achieve 100. And the average capacity of our various resources are simply not enough to deliver that. So now I have multiple constraints, but they are decoupled to a sense, and that's what those buffers mean. A chaotic system is one that I have multiple constraints and they are interactive. And I'm going to show you a quick simulation to show you what that looks like. So a chaotic system is one that's essentially multiple constraints, but they're interactive. They are not properly decoupled. So any small change that's happening to B is automatically transferred over to B, C, D, E. So A has a problem, it's transferred to the rest of the system. D has a problem, it's transferred to the rest of the system. And that makes the output of the system completely unpredictable. And you've probably looked at the queuing graph that John had shared with you in his lecture. A chaotic system is one that is entering that zone where your lead time starts growing exponentially, your reliability starts dropping exponentially, and the throughput also starts dropping. The dice game that I'll show you now is a very interesting simulation for those that have read The Goal. If you haven't yet, I can highly recommend reading the book. I'll show you the simulation now, but just imagine the following. You've got a simple factory with 5 machines. The output of every machine is determined by the throw of a dice. So it's a uniform distribution. Every machine, A, B, C, D, E, can produce somewhere between 1 and 6 with an average of 3.5. And the question is, how much is this system going to produce in 100 days? And the common mistake we make is we say, oh, that's simple, right? Few parts, few interdependencies here. Each machine, it's perfectly balanced. There's a takt time here that we've put in place, perfectly balanced system. It should be easy. The system should be able to produce 3.5 times 100, 350 units of widgets or services or project tasks over a 100-day period. Well, when you run the simulation, you'll see that you get much less out than what you expect. And I'll show you the simulation now. You're going to get much less out. An interesting thing is a small change in that chaotic system can have a big impact. So just adding buffers in between to decouple it a little bit. So if A got a 4 that day, right? So it could produce 4 units, but B only got a 2. So it was only able to process 2 units that day or 2 project tasks or deal with 2 patients that day. Then without a buffer, that additional 2 that A could have produced is gone. Whereas with a buffer, that one of those could go in to be available in the next round when maybe A gets a 2 and B gets a 4. So a small change in the right area can have a big impact here. We've taken our output from 165 to 210. If we increase the buffers to maybe 5, we'll increase it even further. And then I'll show you a very counterintuitive thing is, what if we create a constraint and we make sure it's properly buffered, and we use that constraint to make our commitments. So we're not going to make commitments of 3.5 because that's simply not possible. We're going to actually create a constraint in the system, slow it down, not overcommit, and use that as a way of making commitments, and suddenly we perform exceptionally well. So let me quickly show you the game. Right, so the brief background here is, as I mentioned, this is a game that was created. It appears in the goal, and what it is simply is to say, here I've got this little factory. The output is determined by the throw of a dice for every machine. I'm going to run it for 100 days. Every time I produce a product, I get $100 for it. I've got 50% variable cost. I've got operating expenses of about $13,000 here. So I should expect to get a net profit of about 10%. That's my budget based on an expectation that I can on average do 3.5, because my machines on average can do 3.5. So let me run the simulation and see what happens. You'll see the Gantt chart here at the bottom for each of the machines. And the blue portion is when that machine was blocked. And the red portion is when it was starved. So you can see the lots of blockage and starvation. And in this case, we got only 160 out compared to what we expected, because there's no buffers in between. So if A got a 1, it doesn't matter what B, C, D, or E could have done that day, only 1 will go through. The same way, A, B, C, D had great days. They all flew 6s, right? They could process 6 project tasks or make 6 widget eats. But poor E got a 1, only 1 will come out. So that's a dramatic asymmetrical distribution here. So let me show you what happens if we just add buffers of 1. Right? It's a chaotic system. We've just decoupled it a little bit. It's still not properly decoupled, but just a small change, how much of an impact that can make. And I can notice already on the Gantt chart here, much less starvation and blockage, still a heck of a lot, but much less than before. You can see we've gone from 160 to 213. That's a massive increase in the throughput. We're still losing money and we're still overcommitting, so our reliability is shocking. It's only 60% at the moment, but it's a dramatic increase in throughput. So what's the next change that we can do? Well, we can increase these buffers to make sure that they are properly protected. And by the way, the level of starvation and blockage is a way of checking whether our buffers are big enough to cope with the variability in either the demand or the supply side. So we're running it again. You can see my buffer sizes is now 5. You can see immediately much less starvation and blockage here. There's still some, but there's much less than before. So we expect to get a much bigger outcome. And as we're now up to 276. So we went from 160 to 210 to 276 just by adding some buffers into the system to protect the system from that variability and from being properly interdependent from the previous rounds. So now let's apply the very counterintuitive solution. Imagine you've been running this factory, you're committing 350 every 100 days, and you're just not able to get it. You're getting, it's like 250, 260, 270, but you're not getting close to the plan of 350. What do you think your reaction will be as an operations manager if I said to you, I'm going to take the first resource and I'm going to slow it down. I'm going to prevent it from throwing 6s. So the average will drop to 3. What would be your gut reaction? What will happen to throughput if I've taken one of the resources and I'm slowing it down? You're already not achieving your target. Of course, you'd be extremely upset and say, what the hell are you doing? But there's 2 things that's going to happen. It's the first thing is I'm going to change my commitment. I'm no longer going to commit to 3.5. I'm now going to commit to 3 per day, or over the 100 days, I'm going to commit to 300 sold at $100 each, gives me $30,000. That's going to be my budget. But secondly, I can manage this whole system by managing making sure it's never starved of orders and making sure it's never blocked. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this buffer here and increase it a little bit so it's never blocked. And we'll rerun it again and see what happens. Now I can immediately see here there's a little bit of starvation here. So I ran out of orders at some point. There's still some blockage, but look at this. I'm getting 282 out. That's a 94% reliability. And as a result, I've actually made even more money than what I expected. So this is a very quick way of showing how with a simple system like a dice game, if you have balanced capacities without proper decoupling, you're going to have a chaotic system. The system will produce much below than what you expected, and it will be much more unreliable than what you expected. But of course, what happens in real life is some cost accountant comes in, or some consulting company comes in and says, wow, there's a lot of waste here. Look at these guys. They all can do 3.5. We can reduce their capacity. Let's go back and we reduce their capacity. So now we've got a perfectly balanced system again. And why is there such a big buffer here? This is unnecessary. Let's reduce it down. So now I've got a much more efficient system, right? Let's rerun it and see what happens. Remember, we had 282 and the distribution was very narrow there. So we're becoming very reliable. Somebody came in and they saw all this waste. They cut all the waste. And guess what's happened? We're back to 244. And this is, I hope, a good example, very simple example, but a good example. You can apply this across a whole supply chain. One of the most common mistakes that are being made in organizations today is that they are trying to balance capacities. They don't understand what will happen. They are overcommitting on the one side, and secondly, that they don't have enough buffers. Inside this little simulation model, and I'll give you access today, it's on Goldratt's dicegame.com. You can go in there, you can download the app. It's a free app. It'll give you a trial for 14 days to play around. And you can even do scenario analysis like this, where you can run each of those scenarios that I ran, you can run them 50 times and compare the average performance with the standard deviation and all the key parameters. So I hope that was useful to illustrate the essence of theory of constraints is that if we have a chaotic system, we can't manage it. And that leaves us to this graph that you've probably seen that John has, I know in his slide decks, he normally refers to it, is to say, I'm managing the system, right? I'm starting to commit to more and more demand. Initially, my queue time is pretty linear, right? It's constant and then it starts growing maybe a little bit. My reliability is very high. My throughput keeps on going up until I hit this sort of threshold of what my bottleneck is capable of. And that's at about 80% utilization. What will happen then? My expectation is that I can extrapolate based on the past. What I don't realize is I've just entered the chaos zone. My queue times or lead times will grow dramatically. My reliability will drop down. My throughput will drop down. And I can't manage a system that's in chaos. And unfortunately, so many organizations today is in chaos. You see it on people's faces. One of the questions I ask people, even at a company like Microsoft, where are you at the moment? You personally, when you make commitments, are you confident that you can deliver that commitment? When you say that something will take you 1 day, will it really take 1 day? And there's a very simple example to illustrate how bad this gets. If I ask you, how long will it take you to do a 1-day task? The right answer would be, it depends. What does it depend on? Well, it depends on your utilization, right? If you don't have anything on your plate right now, then a 1-day task should take you 1 day. But what if you're already 50% utilized? Then that 1 day makes up, 1 day out of the 1 day that you already have there. So it will take you 1 day to clear what you're already busy with and another day to finish the 1-day task. So it will take you 2 days to complete it. What if you were 70%, 75% utilized? So now the stuff that's already sitting in your inbox is now 75%. So that's 3 days of work that you first have to get through before you get to your 1-day task. So it'll take you 4 days to complete it. What if you're 90% utilized? It'll take you 10 days to complete that 1-day task. What if you are 99% utilized? It'll take you 100 days to complete a 1-day task. And my question to you is, how utilized are you? How utilized are your direct reports and the people that you report to? And that's what we see here is most organizations today is in chaos because they don't understand these fundamentals. So how do I prevent that? I have to find a way of getting out of chaos without jumping all the way to the other side, which is there my throughput will start dropping again. So just a brief cause and effect here. The importance of a constraint is that if I have a bottleneck, I get backlogs. I see this growing backlog. My inbox is getting fuller, or the level of orders are going up, right? If I have too small buffers, my reliability goes up. But what is the impact of that? It will reduce my throughput and it will cause me to have higher cost. And I'll show you a practical example of that. Why is that? Dino said it's important to apply the 5 whys, right? Why do resources become bottlenecks? They don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to be a bottleneck. Somebody's bad decision made them a bottleneck, right? We either overcommitted their capacity, like what we did in the dice game. We thought we could do 3.5 a day, but it turns out that when you have a system with variability and interdependency, you can't perform close to what the bottleneck is capable of. The only way to do that is to make sure that that bottleneck is, first of all, properly buffered so it's not starved or blocked, and it's not overproducing. It's not producing stuff that's not needed or not needed now. Why do we have too small buffers? Because we often underestimate variability and we underestimate the impact of not having enough buffers. And that was very evident with this COVID-19 crisis, right? The coronavirus is not a black swan. It was a white swan. Every 10 years, we've been hit by a coronavirus. The problem with this one is that most people didn't become symptomatic. And even if you became symptomatic, there was a delay of about 5 to 15 days of that. And in the meantime, the virus spread like crazy. In the previous coronaviruses, MERS and SARS, everybody that got it became symptomatic, and they became symptomatic almost immediately. So it was very easy to control. You checked who had a fever and you quarantined them. And that was it. But what it exposed is that most supply chains, especially the medical supply chains, didn't have enough buffers. They didn't have the ability to quickly ramp up. And why is that? Why do we make these bad decisions? Because of bad assumptions. And that's where the thinking processes of fear of constraints comes in. They are designed to find and overcome these limiting or bad assumptions. So I hope that puts in context this graph that you have probably seen a couple of times so far, and how it relates to a constraint in the system. If I have multiple constraints in the system and they're not decoupled, I get chaos. I'll see my lead times going up, I'll see my reliability dropping, and I'll see my throughput dropping. And that's true not just for supply chain, it's also true for you. I mentioned that fear of constraints has got these logistical applications to help us improve flow. And you've already covered Little's law that says the average inventory or work in process is equal to your throughput rate or your flow rate or throughput multiplied by the flow time or the lead time. So when you manipulate that and you say, I want to use Little's law to predict what will happen if I make a change in either my work in process or flow time, my lead time, on the flow rate. What will happen if I reduce WIP in that equation? Well, if flow time doesn't change, my flow rate will actually go down. And that's why people are so terrified that if we say to them, control the inventory, don't release everything as soon as possible. Dino mentioned that there's one of the techniques that's called constant WIP or con-WIP, right? Reduce the level of inventory. Don't start all the projects at the same time. Start one thing, finish it. That's all controlling WIP. But people are terrified that if they reduce the WIP, their flow rate is going to go down, because they intuitively understand Little's law, even if they might not ever have heard of it. The mathematics says you reduce the WIP, the flow rate will go down mathematically. But actually, if you think about that graph, that's true only if you're in the stable zone. In this stable zone, if you reduce the WIP or the utilization, your throughput will go down. If you are in the chaotic zone, a small reduction in WIP will have a dramatic increase in throughput because it reduces the flow time dramatically. So a small reduction in WIP will cause a big reduction in the flow time, because you're going from there to there, and as a result, flow rate goes up. So that's always our first step. We don't start off a project and say, where's the bottleneck? We check, is this company in chaos zone? If they're in chaos, it would be completely futile to try and find the bottleneck. If you look at that dice game, where's the bottleneck? It moves every day. So what's the first thing that we do is we control the WIP. We reduce we pick a resource, we turn it into a constraint by not overcommitting its capacity, and we're controlling the WIP, and that will automatically increase the flow rate. Of course, we can't keep on reducing the work in process, because then we'll start starving critical resources. So then we have to control the WIP, and then we look at what else can cause delays in the flow time and focus on that. So prevent starvation, blockage, quality issues, etc. So that's a basic idea. So I'll end off with just a couple of the summaries of the other areas. So Dino mentioned that when you look at lean or Toyota production system and fear of constraints, they are all based on the same principle. There's a fantastic article that Dr. Goldratt wrote in cooperation with one of the direct students of Taichi Ono. It's called Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. I'll make sure that you all get copies of it. And what Dr. Goldratt said was he wanted to see what's in common between what Henry Ford discovered, what Ono discovered, and what he discovered with theory of constraints. And it turns out that there's 4 concepts that they all used. So even though the applications are different in terms of Toyota production system or drum buffer up, they all use the same concepts, which is number 1 priority for operations is focus on improving flow. You have other priorities as well, which is reduce cost, improve reliability, improve quality. But if you could find a way of increasing the flow of the system, reduce the flow time, increase the flow rate, all of these other parameters automatically goes up. Secondly, improving flow won't happen by itself simply because you've made it a goal, especially if the rules that you need to improve the flow are counterintuitive, like the one I showed in the dice game, how by slowing down one of the resources, turning it into a bottleneck, actually increases my output. That's very counterintuitive. Both of all these Ford, Ono, and Goldratt realized that I needed a practical mechanism to prevent overproduction. Ford used space. So if the space between two machines were full, stop production. Later on, it became conveyor belts, but it was still controlled by space. Of course, that mechanism works fantastically well if you're producing only one model car, Model T. Ono came along and said, but what if we produce a range of cars? How do I know what should be in that space? And he had to invent Kanbans to tell you what should be in that space. How big should be the Kanban for every part that the machine can be producing? And they used the color status of those Kanbans, how full or empty it was, to determine priority for upstream machines on which Kanbans they should fill. Goldratt came around and said, what if we produce so many variety that by keep on filling Kanbans, if we don't know if that part will be needed now or might ever be needed, we'll be doing exactly the same thing that we're trying to prevent. We're causing people to overproduce by filling up Kanbans that we don't know if it's going to be needed now. What's the only other mechanism that you can use to control WIP? And he came up with the idea of time buffers that says we're going to control the WIP not by units, but by time. So we'll release only 2 weeks of work into the system. And by that, we're controlling our lead time to two weeks. And by that, we can ensure that we never get into that chaos zone. And by the way, the penetration into that time or stock buffers we'll use as a way of prioritizing. And then the last two concepts was they all were obsessed in abolishing local efficiencies. Anything that's preventing people from adhering to these mechanisms that they created, so that they keep on overproducing to keep the machines busy and make their efficiencies look good, or that they are not synchronizing their priorities, you have to abolish those things. And then the last part is you need a focusing mechanism that says if there's been a change in demand or supply, where do I focus management attention so I can rebalance it? So that's just briefly the 4 principles of flow that has been used by all the giants to build specific applications. But applications always have boundary conditions. So my advice always to companies is don't just go and adopt lean or theory of constraints or agile or Scrum or critical chain project management. Make sure you understand what boundary conditions that solution was created for. So go back to these original concepts and see if you can't derive it for you. I mentioned about throughput accounting, about a key way of measuring the impact of changes. And as managers, this is one of the key things that you're going to have to do, is to identify, of all the things that I can improve, which ones will give me the biggest positive impact on the system as a whole. You want to go and make changes or exercise options that have a big upside if they work and a small downside if they don't. You want to completely stay away from options that has the opposite, right? Small upside if they work and a big downside if they don't. And to illustrate that, I'll share with you just a brief example. A few years ago, a CEO of a Fortune 500 company phoned me. I'm friends with the chairman of the company. I recognize the person's name. If I say the name, you'll all recognize him. And I got this call. I was quite surprised because we had never met in person. And he said to me, Alan, we've never met. Our chairman said I should give you a call. I said, that's really nice. How can I help? He said, well, he's disagreeing with my decision. And he said, I need to check it with you. I said, well, so what's the situation? He said, well, our profits are about 10%, below expectations. The market has been very brutal. Our share price has started dropping. And I'm planning to make 10% layoffs to try and, recover the profits and build confidence back into the market. And to be honest with you, confidence back in me, right? That I'm a good leader, that I can make those tough decisions when it has to be. So I said, okay, so I get that. So your thinking was, you got your teams to commit to a target of say 100. They performed to 90. They must have asked for enough resources to achieve the 100. So if they only got 90, they should have 10% too much resources, right? So it should sound fair to ask for them to get rid of 10% of those excess resources. He said, exactly. Can you phone the chairman and tell him that you agree with me? I said, no, I didn't say I agreed with you. I just said I understand how you would arrive at that conclusion. He said, so what is your advice? I said, well, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you how to think about it. And a way to think about whether this change is a good change to make or a good option to exercise is, does it have a big upside if it works and a small downside if it doesn't? Or is it the opposite? Could it have a small upside if it really works and a big downside if it doesn't? So he said, what do you mean? I said, let me ask you a question. The layoffs that you're planning to do, who will it impact? And he gave me the range of people that would be impacted. I said, okay, if you add up all their salaries and wages, how much is that as a percentage of total sales? He said, it's about 20%. I said, okay, so you're planning a reduction of 10% in that pool of resources. Yes. So I said, so the biggest upside that you could potentially expect from this is a 2% increase in net profit. And he sort of stayed quiet. And he said, can you go through the numbers again? So I said, you're planning to reduce costs that's 20% of your revenue, and you're planning to reduce it by 10%. So that means that the net profit impact will be 10% of 20%. It's only 2%. He goes, wow, he somehow thought it would be bigger. I said, okay, but now let's think about the downside. What if this doesn't work out? What's going to happen in the next 6 months to all your growth strategies and continuous improvement programs? For the next 6 months, your managers are going to just focus on who can we lay off in the most fair way. They're going to be consumed with HR. They're never going to get time to deliver on those things that they've committed to. And what if the unions go on strike? And what if you lose your top people? What if your competitors hear about this and pounce on it and tell your customers, look, these guys are making layoffs. Who the hell knows if they're going to be able to supply you? Give us your business. And every one of those that I shared with him, the downside was building up and up and up. And he said, oh God, I would have made the worst possible decision in my life. So what I want to share with you here is throughput accounting is a very simple way of quantifying the impact of small changes, local changes on the system as a whole. And it does that by just splitting completely what is total variable cost and what is fixed cost or operating expenses. So these are the elements. I've listed them. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but as a manager, if you want to contribute to improving the profitability of the company, if it's a for-profit company, or the viability of the company, if it's a non-profit, you can impact it in one of 5 ways. You can contribute by increasing the sales revenue, by reducing discounts, selling direct, or getting price premiums for time-sensitive markets. That will increase the average selling price of the products that you are selling or the services that you're providing. You can also help to increase sales revenue by preventing shortages or increasing availability or improving due date performance. That will reduce lost sales. You can also help to reduce variable cost and working capital by preventing over-purchasing, which will increase your catch, overproduction, over-purchasing. You can also reduce variable costs by demanding from your suppliers to have lower purchase prices. But for you to win there, they have to lose. And of course, last option, and I put it last because it's normally the worst option, unless the business is facing bankruptcy and you simply have no other choice, like many businesses had during the COVID crisis, where you have to furlough people or lay them off because else the business won't survive, is you can also reduce your operating expenses by reducing salaries or reducing the number of people. But that means for you to win, the employees must lose. So how much will a 1% improvement in each of these increase your net profit and ROI? I've given you the spreadsheet. I know it's a little bit small. You'll get a copy of the slides, but let's just take the first one. If I could increase the average selling price by just 1% on a business that has 100 million in sales and 5 million in net profit, that 1% will increase my revenue to 101. My variable cost won't go up. My fixed cost or operating expenses won't go up. So my profit goes from 5 to 6 million. That's a 20% increase in net profit for just a 1% improvement in the average selling price. And that doesn't mean we've increased our selling price. It just means that we give 1% less discount. That's leverage. If you look at the second one, of course, if you can increase sales by reducing lost sales, again, your sales revenue will go up by 1 million, but this time you'll have to pay for the variable cost, which in this case is 40%. So that additional 600,000 will drop to the bottom line, increasing your net profit from 5 to 5.6, which is a 12% increase in net profit. For every 1% change that you can make in reducing lost sale, that's still huge. Reducing over purchasing, your sales won't go up, but by not buying stuff that you don't need, you'll get a 400,000 improvement here. That's an 8% improvement. The other two will give you 8% and 2% reductions. Just adding these free 1% of the first free, which is a win for everybody, will give you a 40% increase in net profit. That is leverage, and that's where managers should be focusing on. Using number 4 and 5 only in extreme cases, and always look at how they can contribute with number 1, 2, and 3. Unfortunately, as is the common mistake when people are in chaos and they're not achieving their targets, they immediately go to, I need more resources. Unfortunately, in most real-life organizations, when profitability is below expectation or the organization is not viable, unfortunately, managers often jump immediately to number 4 and 5 without first exploring number 1, 2, or 3. So I hope that was useful. How can TOC thinking processes help leaders resolve decision conflicts that force them to make bad decisions? I mentioned the COVID crisis. So in thinking processes, what we do there is we start with some problem or gap. So think about your organization or even your family. What was the problem that triggered the need for change? The problem that we're analyzing here with the thinking processes is COVID-19 has dramatically reduced the income of our organization or family. So the first thing that we do is we want to make sure that this is an important enough problem to focus our limited attention and budget on. So how do we do that? We simply ask, why is this bad for you? What is the local impact of this problem? Well, if we get it wrong, I will blame myself or be blamed for the future, for the failure. Okay, and why is it bad for the system, for the organization? Well, if we get it wrong, we might never recover or might never fully recover from that. And that's a real risk for many organizations and many families out there. So what is the conflict I face as a result of this problem? Well, on the one side, I feel overwhelming pressure that as soon as I heard about this, as a manager, it doesn't matter which level in the organization I am. I could be the business owner or the CEO, or I could be the manager of the store. I feel pressure to act immediately to reduce the cost and secure other demand or supply sources for whatever I need to produce. Versus, don't take drastic action, wait and see. Those are my two options. The problem is, of course, there's a positive, a pro of acting immediately, which is we ensure that we can survive the crisis and reduce the uncertainty to all. So the faster we can pull off that Band-Aid and say, listen, this is what's happened. We need to protect the organization. You guys are going to go on furlough, or we're going to ask you to stay at home. We'll reduce the salaries by this time. We're not sure. The longer you drag it out, the more uncertain it becomes. And the longer we wait, the more costly often to recover and the higher the chance of you being blamed. But there's also a positive of not taking action, which is you avoid those uncomfortable discussions and you can focus on other priorities. I mentioned recently on an international panel discussion, people were complaining about all these political leaders that was, taking so long to react. And I said, I had huge sympathy with them because the problem is they don't understand the exponential function, right? You have something that's growing exponentially. Imagine yourself, you've got a few hundred people that have contracted COVID and 10 people that have died. Are you going to take action? You say, no, there's many other higher priority things in my country. Okay, now the 100 has become 1,000. Are you going to take action? You say, no, there's many other higher priority things. We've got limited budget, we've got limited attention. But what you don't realize is the doubling time, right? Is at one stage, COVID-19 cases was doubling every 2-3 days. And that's what we're seeing now in South Africa, as we're starting to see this exponential function just going out of control. And that's really scary. I admired our government for taking such decisive action very early on. And as a result, they've probably saved millions and millions of cases that would have completely overloaded our health system. But now it's what they're going to do now. Each of these have got a goal to achieve if I get all the pros and the threat. But there's also the other part is, how did we get into this situation? What was the cause of this problem? We failed to have buffers in place that could have limited the downside or allowed us to capitalize on the upside of a crisis like COVID-19. What should we have done? We should have taken actions to buffer the impact of any big downside risk and enough high-low options to pivot very quickly, either getting additional sources of demand or supply. And again, each of these have got pros and cons, and that's what makes it so difficult to resolve these conflicts. We're stuck in ambivalence, right? We see both the pro and con of doing something and the pro and con of not doing something, and then we get stuck and we end up procrastinating, and then at the end we overreact and make a really bad choice like that CEO did or could have done. What the thinking processes of theory of constraints does, this specific one that I'm showing you now is a pro-con cloud method that I developed based on standing on the shoulders of the giants like Benjamin Franklin's pro-con list, and also the evaporating cloud method that was developed by Goldratt. Is this helps us to check what are the limiting assumptions. And you can see here the reason why we didn't make this change early on is we underestimated the positive of the ability to survive a crisis and even flourish from it. And we downplayed the con of not doing it. So our limiting assumption was events with a low probability won't happen or won't happen to us. So no need to protect against it, right? Really? Like I said, this coronavirus isn't a black swan. It's been happening every 10 years. We've just been very unlucky with how this virus spreads and stays dormant and doesn't become symptomatic for the majority of the people. It makes it very hard to be able to quarantine. There's also an assumption that we have to challenge. This is a planning conflict, right? If we can resolve this by making sure that we do take action early and have enough options, we will dramatically reduce the risk that this will happen. On the execution side, what was our bad assumption here is that in a crisis, it's better or safer to wait and see, as we are more likely to be blamed for overreacting, looking silly and being exposed, you wolf whistle, you overreacted, than underreacting. Really? If there's exponential growth and finite resources involved, my advice to leaders is panic early. Don't procrastinate early. Panic early. That's the way to prevent this from happening again and making sure that we can act very quickly. So the last part is just how do you put all of this together into a business strategy? Dino mentioned, there's a major strategic choice for businesses. And I'm going to take an extreme case like a mine, right, where a pull-based system is not obvious, right? If you are dealing in retail and you've got thousands or even hundreds of thousands of SKUs, then a pull-based strategy makes perfect sense, right? Don't produce stuff that's not needed, allow the market to pull and only replenish based on actual consumption. But what if you've got a mining supply chain and you've got 3 products? Surely there's not a big risk to push so that I can keep my mind busy. So what we did here was we created a simulation model. It's conceptually similar to the dice game that I showed you, but it's monitoring a full supply chain. And on top there, we were simulating the supply chain in a push mode. So basically the mine was keep on producing as much as it can, that output sitting in a stockpile, the trucks picking it up, taking it to the process plant, the trains arriving, picking up the product in those free buffers at the process plant for high grade, low grade, and fines, the trains taking it off to the port, and then sitting in the buffers at the port and the ships that was ordered 20, 25 days before coming to pick up the product. Compared to a pull strategy, where you're not trying to sell what you've produced, but you're getting every link to only produce what has already been sold and not overcommitting. So only committing 80% of your production volume of the mine to contract sales, and the other 20% you're selling on the spot market. And we ran these simulations for 5 years, and this was the average results that we got. With a push system, the best profit we got was 5%. With pull, 25% net profit. ROI went from 9 to 46%. Due date performance went from 52 to 98%. The daily mine output went from 8.4 kilotons a day to 9.1 kilotons a day. And very interestingly, the reason why they were pushing was they're saying we have to keep our cost per ton down. But they don't realize that there's a difference between the cost per ton produced and the cost per ton sold. Their target was $100 per ton, and they were achieving that per ton produced. But what they were selling was causing their cost to be $120 a ton, whereas in a pool system, they can get back to $99 per ton. And then, of course, the other part is the amount of events that was happening, the chaos when you are pushing and you're doing it, especially in a balanced capacity environment. This whole supply chain was very balanced, similar to the dice game. They were getting 24 events every single day with alarms going off that was demanding the management attention, which is essentially the ultimate constraint in any business. Is top management attention is the ultimate constraint. Why? Because a number of things that demand your attention as a manager will always exceed your available attention. So don't waste your management attention by trying to improve everything and paying attention to everything. But that's what unavoidably happens when you're in chaos. You have to get out of chaos. And in that case, implementing a pull system here got them out of chaos. They went from 24 management intervention events per day down to 3. So I hope that was useful. That is the summary. And my final quote is, there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. Famous quote by Victor Hugo. And I think the time for understanding how to manage and improve and constantly improve operations and supply chains, making sure you focus on the right areas, making sure you're properly protected, making sure you implement those rules that can both increase the output and at the same time improve variability. I think there's never been a more important time than what we've got now.
Would you like me to go through the questions on the chat?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, there's quite a lot.
Morning. Okay, so the question that I had was, so systems are not always transparent and constraints are often not visible. So in your experience, how do you assist companies to create transparency in the system to be able to identify those constraints before they become a serious operational problems?
A great question. If you think about that dice game as a simple analogy, imagine you walked into that environment, right? The bottleneck is moving all the time. It's kind of invisible. So trying to identify the bottleneck in chaotic environments is a completely futile effort. What you should do is to say, how do I control the release of work into the system so that the bottleneck becomes very apparent? And that's essentially what we did with that simple system. We actually slowed down that first resource, which is controlling the release of work into the system. That gets the system out of chaos. It allows us to make much more reliable commitments, and then we can see it. On a very practical way, you could use IT systems. So imagine every transaction that's being done in a company. There's normally some kind of electronic transaction, right? So imagine you were in procurement. Your inbox is essentially the purchase requisitions arriving in your inbox, right? Your job is to turn those into purchase orders. So what we could do if we were clever, we could use all the transactional data of the purchase requisitions arriving in your inbox, and we can plot that cumulatively compared to the completions, right? Your purchase orders going out. And by looking at those cumulative graphs, we can see, are you becoming a bottleneck? Is the arrival rate in your inbox faster or slower than the rate at which you completed? So that's another little trick that you could use, is simply start looking at what transactional data they've got and monitor the arrival rate of work, whether you're a law firm and it's a number of cases that's arriving versus the number of cases you're completing, or you're in a project environment, the number of tasks that you are responsible for completing. What is the arrival rate of that task versus what's your completion rate? And just plotting those cumulatively can tell you very quickly where the real bottleneck is.
All right, thank you for that. Then my other question is, why are companies always committed to operate at 100% capacity if it's actually not a good decision for operations?
Great question. Very simply is that we think that an idle resource is a major waste. And I think we feel it intuitively, right? Imagine sitting idle for 20% of the time. So say every Friday you take off, 20% of the time you're sitting idle. It'll make you feel uncomfortable. But what you don't realize is that is the time that you need to absorb normal variability. So a very simple planning algorithm that we give to factories, if they're running 5 days a week, we say to them, make your commitment based on 4 days capacity and keep the 5th day as a buffer. If you had a great week, you can use that 5th day to do planned maintenance, to do training, or maybe even to pull forward some of the demand for the next week. But if you had a bad week, then you can use that 5th day to catch up. And what's counterintuitive, now I showed in a dice game, is that how by doing that, not only it will make us more reliable, but it will actually increase the throughput. And that is very counterintuitive. And that's why most people miss it. And they keep on trying to utilize resources 100%. And we see it in 2 ways. They design supply chains to be totally balanced, and that just puts them into that chaos zone. Or, like the last mistake that I mentioned in a dice game, the system is now performing really well. It's very reliable, high levels of throughput, and some idiot arrives, some new manager or consulting company, and says, look at all the waste. And they take out all that protective capacity and buffers. They push the system back into chaos, and then you're back to square one. So I think it's an education issue. This is a part that people are ignorant of the damage that they are doing by trying to utilize resources 100%. What I normally do for executives is I share with them that example of how long will a 1-day task take, right? And say, do you think it's a good idea for you to be 100% utilized? Because it means that 1-day task will never be completed. If you're 90%, 99% utilized, it will take you 100 days. You really want your whole business to be waiting for you 100 days to complete a 1-day task? No. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thank you very much. And then the last one is, does the pull system work on a forecasted demand or on actual demand or secured sales?
Very, very good question. So, of course, a pull system by definition is working on actual demand. But there are environments where you need a hybrid. And the hybrid is to say, if we could forecast what the substantial changes in demand is going to be. So say you are selling a product that's very seasonal, right? And you put in a pull system. It might be that there's going to be too long of a lag between the changes in demand that's triggering the pull system and you placing, production orders or purchase orders. And as a result, you might end up sitting with too much or too little. So often cases is you want a mechanism that can look at the forecast and only pick up if there's major increases in demand or major decreases in the demand, and then proactively react to that. One of the simulations that you can also play around with is one that we've built called hannashop.com. Similar to Goldratt's dice game here.com that you'll see. It's an interactive simulation, but it's for retail and distribution center environment. And that shows you how these hybrid rules work. We've created one in Fear of Constraints. Demand-driven MRP is also a new one that is both looking backwards and forwards. Backwards mean what's the actual demand, looking forwards is what's the forecasted demand. The trick there is to come up with an algorithm that is paying attention to forecast, but not too much. So it's able to separate signal in a forecast versus noise. And that's a tricky thing. It takes a bit of time to set that up. But nowadays with the new technology, you can automate that whole process. So if anybody's interested there, they're welcome to download and play around with this simulation called hannashop.com.
So Lindo, are you ready with your questions?
Yeah. So my question basically was, with respect to Eskom, they seem to be struggling to meet demand all the time, and there's all this, variability that they can't manage. So, I mean, based on your lecture today, what would be your advice with regards to that? My second question, I think, is related to the COVID-19, and you were talking about why some leaders took time to react, all those types of things. So my question was, what would have been the impact if we had acted earlier and closed, international borders to prevent the virus from coming in and continue with local economy, as opposed to waiting and eventually, having it shut down?
So on your first question, in the 80s and some portion of the 90s, Eskom was extremely responsible in making sure that the electricity network never got overloaded, that they stayed well outside that chaos zone. So the utilization of the electrical grid at that stage were often not more than 75%. So they had a deep understanding of how important it is to keep electrical networks far away from that chaos zone. As a result, we were the lowest cost energy producer in the world and had some of the highest uptime. I mean, these type of things that we're currently experiencing with all the load shedding, that was unheard of in the 80s. We were the lowest cost producer, but we also had the most surplus capacity. And then a consulting company was hired. They looked at all of this and said, you've got far too much capacity in the system. You can dramatically reduce the capacity by mothballing certain of the old power stations that was too expensive to run and delaying the CapEx program. And they got paid a massive bonus as a result of all their cost savings. And it's caused us to go into chaos. And once you're in chaos, it's a bitch to get out of it, right? You have to have very courageous leadership that goes back and says, we have to get the surplus capacity back up. We can't overcommit. So that's related to your first question. The second question is, what's been the cost of delays? It's been horrific. We are building simulation models. We started already in January, where we were building simulation models around the COVID-19 crisis. And our models are showing that about 80% of all the deaths could have been prevented, but the economic impact has been massive. Our economic models were showing that if leaders had acted early, so if you took a country like the US, if they had acted early and they made sure that they had all the buffers in place, right? Critical ventilators, PPE, that they had started announcing certain programs that can support small businesses. They announced very early on that, we're going to try to keep the economy open as much as possible, but on the condition that everybody wears masks and that we maintain the social distance. And if you don't need to be at work, then don't come to work, right? And we give high priority to all those people that have got compromised immune systems, the older people that have underlying conditions like heart conditions, HIV, TB, etc. Those actions would have cost billions of dollars. By not taking those actions, it's now costing trillions of dollars. That's the reality. It's literally, our model has shown about 1,000 times the cost of not taking action early. You can hear that I'm pretty frustrated and passionate about this. At the same time, I fully get why so many politicians and even, business owners took such a long time, because it's very hard when you're dealing with exponential functions. Just one small example is, think about a bottle, and inside the bottle you have one bacteria, and it's doubling every minute. And after 60 minutes, the bottle is full, right? That bottle represents your resource, right? You're the leader of these bacteria. When are you going to panic? At time 59, the bottle is only half full. At time 58, the bottle is only 0.25% full, right? 25% full. At time 57, it's only 12.5% full. When are you going to panic? And that's the problem with the exponential function. One of my mentors earlier in my life, Prof. Albert Bartlett, he said that the biggest weakness of humankind is our inability to understand the exponential function. And I'll leave it like that, as where if you have this perfect storm of exponential growth in demand and you have finite resources, my advice to leaders is don't just look for the bottleneck. Start looking for more bottles. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Alan. And I'm sure that the students will agree that this was an incredibly enlightening session, and probably one that will remain in their minds for their whole lives, I'm sure, especially if they start using and applying some of what you spoke about today. I think with that, I would like to just thank you, Alan, for, again, a very insightful session. You will be passing on those links, etc., that you spoke about, and we'll post it to
absolutely.
the students.
I've shared the slides with you, and you see the Goldratt dice game that's available right now. And the students are also welcome, to send me an email. My email is on the slides, or to check out our website, goldrattresearchlabs.com or dralanbarnard.com. And there's also a lot of videos that we've posted on YouTube that people can watch and subscribe to the channel to make sure that they don't miss any.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.